This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by the great online strategy game, Conflict of Nations. In July of 1864, 2 brigades of Confederate cavalry engaged in a daring raid deep into Union territory. Morgan's raid was the longest cavalry raid of the war, but owing to larger events at the time, it has been relegated to a relative footnote in history. The success of the 1,000-mile raid of John Hunt Morgan is still a matter of dispute among historians, but by any measure it was a daring exploit that brought the war to states in the North. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Talking about the U.S. Civil War raises an interesting question. What would happen if the United States fell into civil war today? Who would start it? What kind of alliances would form? What would happen to the existing U.S. military, and who would rise to leadership? And you can explore that and find your own version of a modern civil war in this really fun, online, PvP, real-time game called Conflict of Nations. In Conflict of Nations, you can play against up to 128 other players in engaging and exciting real-time games that can take weeks to complete. You choose who to play from a huge list of playable nations. If you want to fight the modern Civil War from Maine or Arizona or Texas, it's up to you. You build your forces, tanks, jets, nuclear submarines. You choose your diplomacy, making alliances and attacking your neighbors in epic battles, all to seek world domination. The strategy is fascinating and the game is really enthralling, and what is very cool is that you can play with the same account on both PC and mobile. And you get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. This great offer is only available for 30 days, so act now. The summer of 1863 included some of the bloodiest battles and most important campaigns of the U.S. Civil War. In the east, the Army of Northern Virginia, under General Robert E. Lee, invaded into Pennsylvania in what Lee hoped would be the campaign that would force the Union to sue for peace. While in the west, General Ulysses Grant's Army of Tennessee besieged the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, in the campaign that would cement Union control of the Mississippi River. Put simply, the Union was heavily engaged that summer. But the genesis of the raid to come was not actually driven by either of those campaigns, but by the less well-known Tullahoma or Middle Tennessee campaign that pitted the Union Army of Cumberland against the Confederate Army of Tennessee. There, Confederate General Braxton Bragg sought a diversion that would distract Union troops looking to invade Tennessee. Kentucky was a border state that harbored both significant Union and Confederate sympathies. Bragg decided to send a native Kentuckian, Brigadier General John Morgan, with a substantial force of cavalry there to disrupt Union lines of communication and supply, force the diversion of Union troops, especially cavalry from General William Rosecrans' Army of Cumberland, and generally cause trouble. If Morgan's raid could threaten Louisville, a major center of Union supply, it could threaten the Union hold on the state. In Morgan, Bragg had an able cavalry commander. Morgan had led a successful cavalry raid into Kentucky in July of 1862. The American Battlefield Trust writes on July 4th, 1862, Morgan set out on a 1,000-mile-long ride through Kentucky, destroying railroad and telegraph lines, seizing supplies, taking prisoners, and generally wreaking havoc in the Union rear. His raid made national headlines and helped cement the fearsome reputation of the Southern cavalrymen. Morgan led equally successful endeavors in October and December, which eventually forced some 20,000 Union troops to be detached from the front to guard communication and supply lines. Warfare History Network writes, awarded a Brigadier Star for the stunning exploit and heralded a partisan genius in the Southern press, Morgan earned the sobriquet of Thunderbolt of the Confederacy. Morgan, a classic cavalier of a cavalryman, had suggested to Bragg a daring plan that would take his entire command and raid not just through Kentucky, but across the Ohio River into Indiana and Ohio. Bragg, however, was not so willing to risk his cavalry and placed a strict limit on his brash commander. I like everything you said except crossing the Ohio River into the north. Go ahead and raid Kentucky, capture Louisville if you can, but do not, I repeat, do not cross the river. Stay in Kentucky, go anywhere you want in your home state, but I command you to stay south of the river. However, it appears that Morgan never intended to follow Bragg's orders to stay within Kentucky. With the exception of his second-in-command, Colonel Basil Duke, Morgan did not inform his officers of Bragg's limitation. Morgan's ultimate goals are unclear. By some accounts, he simply wanted to bring the war to the northern states, although it is possible that he was hoping to enlist sympathy from Confederate sympathizers called Copperheads in southern Indiana and to give impetus behind a growing peace movement in the north. But he might have had strategic reasons as well. Morgan confided to Duke, who was married to Morgan's sister, the concern that if they stayed within the confines of Kentucky, the raid would be decided very soon, and he would be driven out or cut to pieces in a few days. Morgan understood that his cavalry would be easily outnumbered, and that success depended upon mobility and staying a step ahead of federal forces. Moreover, by raiding across the Ohio, Morgan apparently hoped to cause panic and thus compel the Union to divert troops and possibly even have Indiana and Ohio demand that their troops be sent home from the front to defend their homes, telling Duke even if he lost his whole command, he would greatly benefit General Bragg by crossing the Ohio River, and only in that way. Still, there's reasons to question his motives. Warfare History Network opines it was evident that Morgan conflated genuine patriotism with unbounded ambition. Crossing the Ohio with a substantial number of troops, observed Duke, had long been a favored idea of his exuberant brother-in-law. While Bragg had initially wanted the raid limited to some 1,500 troops, Morgan had managed to secure more men from the commander of Bragg's cavalry, General Joseph Wheeler. For his raid in 1863, Morgan had a hand-selected and professional force of nearly 2,500, consisting of 8 regiments of Kentucky cavalry, 1 regiment of Tennessee cavalry, and 1 4-gun artillery battery. Duke, who admittedly was not exactly an objective source, said of Morgan, "So general and intense was the interest which Morgan excited among the young men of Kentucky that he obtained recruits from every county, numbers running every risk to join him. Among the Kentuckians joining him on the raid were 2 of his brothers. His force crossed the Cumberland River into Kentucky on July 2nd. Morgan's raid would continue for another 24 days, traveling deeper into Union territory than any other Confederate force of the war. The raid has often received praise for its daring and for Morgan's innovative tactics, including careful misdirection of Union forces. But he did not meet with universal success. An attempt on July 4th to cross the Green River at a place called Tebb's Bend ran into 5 companies, about 200 men of the 25th Michigan Infantry, led by Colonel Orlando Hurley Moore, in entrenched positions. Morgan demanded that Moore's greatly outnumbered force surrender, but Moore refused, saying, "The 4th is a damn bad day to surrender, and I prefer not to." Morgan threw his force against Moore's entrenchments, fortified with cut timber. After 3 hours, he was forced to withdraw. He taken some 80 casualties, 35 killed and 45 wounded, with a disproportionate amount of those officers killed by Union sharpshooters. It was, of course, not the Confederacy's greatest loss of the day, however. Roughly 600 miles to the south and west, after a 47-day siege, Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton's Confederate troops surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Vicksburg. The day before, on July 3rd, Robert E. Lee had been defeated at Gettysburg. The loss proved that Morgan's force was vulnerable to a stout defense. That would be proven again the next day at Lebanon, Kentucky. There, Morgan's force pushed back a surprised and outnumbered Union force of some 400, but a force of just 25 Union soldiers defended the stout stone depot of the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. Despite the overwhelming numbers, the 25 men held for some 6 hours, and Morgan's youngest brother, 19-year-old Lieutenant Thomas Morgan, was killed trying to take the depot. The website Emerging Civil War writes that Thomas fell into his brother Calvin's arms, saying, "Brother Callie, they killed me." While the group finally surrendered, they had not only cost Morgan his brother, but valuable time. Morgan commented, "You 25 damned Yankees have cost me 24 hours. While Morgan had received praise for how he handled the raid, capturing unprepared Union garrisons and capturing prisoners which he paroled. In fact, his trip into Kentucky had failed to distract Rosecrans' cavalry, and while he had destroyed buildings and property in the state and had briefly created a panic in the city, he had never seriously threatened Louisville. His column, reduced to some 1,800 men, crossed the Ohio River into Indiana on 2 captured steamers on July 8th. Officially, although the Union had no way of knowing it at the time, violating the direct orders of General Bragg. The general panic at the time showed in newspaper reports that he had crossed with the inflated number of 8,000 cavalry. But instead of finding Confederate sympathizing Copperheads, he entered a hostile state that was rapidly raising militia forces, called the Indiana Legion, to oppose him. Pursued by growing Union forces, Morgan's force was able to pillage several Indiana towns. In the town of Corydon, he quickly defeated a poorly trained group of some 400 militia on July 9th. The Battle of Corydon is considered by some to be one of only 2 battles, along with Gettysburg, to have been fought on Union ground during the Civil War. In Indiana, Morgan made no friends, with his army looting as it went. After Corydon, he paroled prisoners for ransoms. The Gallipolis, Ohio Journal wrote that Morgan's thieves robbed nearly all of the stores accessible to them, the goods wantonly strewn along their track. This actually was a problem, as the Masonic Library and Museum of Indiana explains. In one unintentionally hilarious incident, the raiders stole 2,000 smoked hams out of a storehouse in DuPont before burning it to the ground. By the next day, that much meat out in the open air attracted such a huge swarm of flies that the annoyed soldiers began tossing them by the roadside. Like a trail of breadcrumbs, the discarded hams left a marked path for Indiana militia troops to easily follow as they chased Morgan's men out of the state. In another incident, however, the museum writes that one of his troopers looted the jewels from the Versailles, Indiana Masonic Lodge. Appalled, Morgan, a Mason himself, ordered their return. While it may seem that Morgan had a free rein in his 5 days in Indiana, in fact, he found himself increasingly hemmed in by Union forces. Encountering a force of some 1,000 militia in the town of Vernon, Morgan attempted to induce the force to surrender, but they refused. It's likely that he could have defeated the poorly trained and equipped militia, but he was being pursued and could not afford the time. The report of the Adjutant General of Indiana, published in 1869, explained the situation. It is evident, notwithstanding General Duke's indifferent allusion to it, that the check at Vernon was something more than an impediment in a convenient road. Morgan was defeated in an important object, and the fast-thickening dangers caused him to abandon his plans almost as soon as he had undertaken to put them into execution. George Geib of Butler University sums up Morgan's time in Indiana on the webpage of the Indiana Historical Bureau. No major Indiana city was occupied, despite the temptations presented by New Albany, Floyd County supply depots, or Indianapolis's prisoner of war camps. On the 13th, his dwindling force entered Ohio, but their days were already numbered. Again, he found his mobility limited by growing Union forces. Morgan was now desperate to escape again across the Ohio and attempt to return to Bragg. On the night of the 18th, he found a ford at Buffington Island, Ohio, blocked by entrenched militia. He decided not to attack in the fading light, but by the next morning, thousands of cavalry under the command of Brigadier General Edward Hobson, as well as Union gunboats, had arrived and surrounded his force. In a brief engagement, the Confederate force was routed and nearly half their number captured. Unable to cross the river, Morgan and some 400 men escaped towards the interior of Ohio, while a small handful of troops were able to cross upriver, the only troops of the raid to make it back to Confederate lines. Morgan was finally run to ground near Salingville, Ohio. The engagement is considered to be the northernmost military action by an official command of the Confederate military, as the force that attacked St. Albans, Vermont in 1864 was not an organized command. Morgan and what was left of his command were forced to surrender near West Point, Ohio on the 26th. The Chicago Tribune opined, "It was a good Sunday's work. Thus ends the raid of this murdering bandit." Morgan's raid was audacious. It was the longest cavalry raid of the Civil War and the farthest north that any Confederate force penetrated the Union. It represented the only significant fighting of the war in Indiana and Ohio. He has often been lauded for his tactics. In his remarkable raid, he had captured and destroyed thousands of dollars in supplies, destroyed 34 bridges, disrupted rail lines, and terrorized thousands in the North. He had, to a small degree, shown the people of the North the suffering that people of the South had endured during the war. The Chicago Tribune opined, if ever a man deserved hanging, it is John Morgan. But he had also violated his orders, and so doing lost his entire command. Rather than raise support for the Confederacy, his looting had galvanized opposition. Geib concludes, Morgan brought the manners and style of a romantic cavalier to his actions, attracting much attention to himself then and now. His effectiveness may, however, be questioned. No railroad was closed for more than a short time, and little evidence exists to suggest Morgan's destruction caused more than inconvenience in the movement of Union soldiers or military shipments. The raid did produce initial civilian fears, but those fears were usually expressed in outpourings of Union sentiment. In the end, 2 brigades of good Confederate cavalry were captured or dispersed, and Union movements in Kentucky were less hindered thereafter. Morgan's raid was a dramatic campaign and a Confederate defeat. While historians still argue over the success of Morgan's raid, there is a general consensus that it had little effect on the wider war, and in that perhaps he was a victim of circumstance, as there was little that 2,400 cavalry were going to do in the face of the twin defeats at Vicksburg and Gettysburg. And as controversial as the raid is, so is Morgan's reputation. Harper's Weekly called him a guerrilla and a bandit. Perhaps historian Edison Thomas summed it up best. Whether you see John Hunt Morgan as a dashing cavalier or as a shameless horse thief, it is impossible not to regard Morgan as a fascinating figure of the Civil War. And again, Morgan proved his daring. On November 17, 1863, he and 5 other officers managed to escape from the Ohio State Penitentiary by tunneling into a courtyard and scaling a wall. He made his way back to Confederate lines. However, Morgan had lost Bragg's confidence, and his subsequent commands were never as substantial as the one that he had taken on the Great Raid. He was killed in an attack by Union cavalry on September 4th, 1864. Conflict of Nations is a free, online PvP strategy game of modern warfare. Choose your own strategy, engage in epic battles, and take over the world. You get an exclusive gift. Click on the link in the description to get 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. The offer is only available for 30 days, so act now. So click the link in the description, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.